Greetings, hypothetical students, and welcome to the not-so-hypothetical Victorian literature course, aka #Viclit. If you do not know what this is, I will link my original announcement video down below, and I will also link down below the Goodreads group. I will also link down below my original video called A Hypothetical Victorian Literature Course, in which I talked about the hypothetical course that I might run were I a Victorian literature professor at a university, which I am not, but it then occurred to me that I could just do effectively that course, but on my channel in video form, because why not? So this is the not-so-hypothetical Victorian literature course. Basic idea and premise of this is that every 2 months for the next year, or 2 years, or 3 years, or however long it takes me to get through all of the fascinating themes of Victorian literature, I will be taking 2 books every 2 months, and I will make a slightly longer video, probably half an hour, maybe longer, talking about how a particular theme present in all of Victorian literature is explored through these 2 particular Victorian novels. I will almost entirely be doing Victorian novels. I think I'm not planning on talking about any plays or poetry because I know slightly less about them and I don't feel that I could incorporate them enough into this series. The idea is that in each of these videos I will talk about 2 books and a particular theme. The first half of the video will be spoiler free and I will talk about the books without any major spoilers, and then I will inform you in the middle of the video that spoiler-free territory no longer exists, and I will then make a spoilery second half of the video talking about the rest of the books, so that even if you don't have the chance to read the books along with me, you will still be able to get something out of the video. I will then be announcing at the beginning of each video what the books will be for the next video in 2 months' time as well. So today we're going to be talking about Great Expectations and Jane Eyre, and it's going to be just a kind of introduction to the Victorian novel. I don't have a particular theme I want to talk about today, and then in 2 months' time, in the month of May, we'll be looking at the theme of industrialisation in Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South and Charles Dickens's Hard Times. Lots of Dickens, of course, but there can be no surprise about that. So, back to today's topic. Charles Dickens's Great Expectations and Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre. So first off, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to each of these 2 novels. Jane Eyre, as I may have already mentioned, was written by Charlotte Bronte and it was published first in the year of 1847. It is a Gothic novel in many ways. It is also a Bildun's romance. It follows the character of Jane Eyre from her childhood. I think when the book starts she's about 10, through to her adulthood, to when she's about 18. She has quite a difficult life. She is an orphan and she is brought up by her aunt who doesn't love her. Her aunt sends her away to school at a young age, and from there she goes on to become a governess. As a governess, Jane goes and works in a place called Thornfield Hall for the mysterious and somewhat charming Mr. Rochester, who is a man of about 20 years her senior, who is not at home very often, has a mysterious background, and has a ward called Adele, who may or may not be his illegitimate daughter. It is a wonderful, wonderful book, one of my favourites. It is the book that got me into 19th century literature, and that's partly why I wanted to talk about it today, because I think it is a perfect introduction to the Victorian novel as a form. Great Expectations by Charles Dickens is another brilliant novel. It's not my favourite Dickens novels, as I've mentioned before, but I think it's one of the best to start with, partly because, like Jane Eyre, it's in the first person, and I think that can be more accessible if you're not used to Dickens's writing style or not used to Victorian literature. It follows a character by the name of Pip. Pip, at the beginning of the book, is somewhere between 8 and 10, I think. I can never remember precisely his age, but he's about the same age as Jane Eyre is in the beginning of Jane Eyre. Pip, like Jane, is an orphan, and Pip is brought up by his sister, who, a little bit like Jane's aunt in Jane Eyre, is not overly fond of Pip, and although she is probably presented as a better woman than Mrs. Reed is in Jane Eyre, Pip's sister, Mrs. Joe, resents that she's had to look after Pip. She is married to the blacksmith, Joe Gardry, who is Pip's friend and protector. Pip becomes apprenticed to Joe Gardry, but then, as the title of the book suggests, when he is perhaps about the age that Jane Eyre is in Jane Eyre for the bulk of the book, Pip comes into Great Expectations. He discovers that he has this mysterious benefactor who is going to sponsor him to become a gentleman, and that is what the book is about. I hope you can see already part of the reason why I've chosen both these 2 books is they both explore quite similar themes and have a similar kind of setup. They both are coming-of-age stories and explore many of the same themes, but they also look at things from different angles. We have a female protagonist, we have a male protagonist, we have a book set in the north, we have a book set in the south, we have a book almost exclusively set in rural areas, and we have a book that is about half and half rural and urban, but in which London is a really important part. And they have very different plot arcs, which I think are really interesting to compare to each other. As I said, they're both Bildun's romance in a way. I can never say that word. They're both Bildun's romance in a way, in that they look at how people develop over time. They're both focused on character and personality and individuality, but they also have really interesting narrative arcs in comparison to each other, in that in many ways Great Expectations is a book about Pip learning that he's really not so great as he thought he was, whereas Jane Eyre is a book about Jane Eyre learning that she's greater than she thought she was. But more on that later. Anyway, I'm really sorry if I talk really quickly. I'm really, really excited about this video. I mean, look how excited I am. Look at all those post-it notes. So what I'm going to do first, before I start talking about the themes that these two books deal with, which are many of the themes I'm going to be going on to talk about in the rest of this series, many of the themes which come up again and again in Victorian literature. Before that, I want to talk about a few different kinds of novels, a few kind of genres within the Victorian novel that both of these books fit into. The first, which I've already mentioned, is the Bildungsroman, Roman, the story of coming of age. A lot of Victorian novels are coming of age stories. I don't think I really realised how young most of the protagonists are in Victorian literature when I started reading Victorian literature, because then I was 13 and people who were 18 seemed quite old, and suddenly when you get to my age now I'm like, oh no, they're all still really young. Jane Eyre, she is really young. She's 5 years younger than me. She sounds much older than me. Obviously, because of different social structures and different methods of education within the Victorian period, age was kind of different. Like, I feel like people were older at 18 in the Victorian period than they are now at 18 to a certain extent. But anyway, Jane Eyre, as I said, begins when she's 10, and the bulk of the action of the book takes place when she's like 18, 19. Pip begins the book at somewhere between 8 and 10. The book is split into 3 parts. It was a 3-volume novel at the time. The first volume basically deals with Pip in his childhood. In the second volume, he's probably somewhere between like 18 and 23, and then in the third volume, he's 23. The bulk of the action and the dramatic climax of the book takes place when he's 23. It was quite fun reading it this time because Pip is my age, but anyway. And this is the case with a lot of Victorian literature. Not all Victorian literature follows characters from their childhood into their adulthood, but a lot does. There are a lot of stories that deal with, one, childhood, but also coming of age and characters over really important turning points in their personality, in their characters. A lot of the female heroines of Dickens are between 18 and 22. I think Little Dorrit, who's 22, is actually one of the elder of Dickens's heroines. And then if you look at Elizabeth Gaskell, I think over the course of North and South, Margaret Hale goes from 19 to 22. In a lot of Bronte novels, characters are in their late teens to very early 20s, and a lot of Victorian literature looks at characters coming of age, characters growing into themselves. And I think this is really interesting because it shows a new kind of interest in characterisation. I haven't read that much from before the 19th century, but many of the novels I have read from before the 19th century, things like Gulliver's Travels or Robinson Crusoe or The Vicar of Wakefield, they have a focus on plot, but they don't have a focus on characters. One of the things I find really interesting about 19th century literature is how that changes. You can see it in Jane Austen, who is obviously pre-Victorian, but you can see the seeds of the interest in characterisation and characters, in individuals, in Jane Austen. And it goes through into the Victorian period, where many books are character studies. They're looking at how individuals change over time, often how individuals grow up and turn into people. So Jane Eyre and Great Expectations are both very much about that. They're about people growing into themselves and becoming more strongly themselves. They're Bildungsromans, and I think they're really interesting, subgenre of Victorian novel. The other kind of novel which is very influential on both of these two is the Gothic novel. Now, the true Gothic period of literature is before the Victorians. It's at the end of the 18th century and the early 19th century. There is a kind of Gothic revival, especially towards the end of the 19th century, something like Dracula was written in the 1890s, but for the most part, the Gothic happened before the Victorian era. Things like the novels of Mrs. Radcliffe, they're all pre-Victorian, but they have a massive influence on the Victorian period, and Gothic themes crop up in so many novels. There's a lot of, even if not just supernatural stuff, a lot of supernatural language. Nothing actually supernatural happens in either Jane Eyre or Great Expectations, but the language in which the characters speak and in which the narrators write is imbued with the supernatural, with mentions of goblins and fairies and pixies. And Rochester accuses Jane of cursing his horse when Pip goes to Satis house in Great Expectations. He keeps on thinking that he sees a kind of future ghost, a vision of Miss Havisham hanging from the brewery. And there's a lot more than just the supernatural that imbues these books from the Gothic. It's also ideas of the taboo, talking about the unmentionable, talking about things which are considered immoral and considered not to be spoken about or not to be thought of within Victorian society. I'll talk about this later in the spoilery section of this video, but I mean things like madness, things like crime, even things like sexuality, to be honest, is something which these books explore in a kind of subtle way. The settings in these books also are quite Gothic as well. Dickens has a wonderful way in Great Expectations of making London really Gothic, in talking about it in this kind of dark, complicated, messy way, especially because Pip's London is so bound up with crime, especially because of his guardian, Mr. Jaggers, who is a lawyer. The very way this begins with him being attacked by a convict who threatens him and makes him get food is quite Gothic and dark, and the whole setting of the moors when he is back in his childhood home is quite quite dark and deserted as well. Then in Jane Eyre we have this very secluded setting of Thornfield Hall. We have all the mysterious noises in the night, the things that Jane doesn't quite understand what's going on here. There are a lot of Gothic influences in that as well. And talking of things that Jane doesn't understand, the other kind of novel which is very important in the Victorian period, which both of these play on, is the mystery novel. Now neither of these are full mysteries, and we see proper mysteries happening in Victorian literature much more later on in the period with stuff like Sherlock Holmes then, and stuff like Wilkie Collins, which are very, very mystery driven. But both of these books do have a kind of mystery at their heart. In Great Expectations it's who Pip's benefactor is, and in Jane Eyre it's kind of what is going on at Thornfield. And this is a major feature in a lot of Victorian novels. Most Dickens novels have some kind of mystery, some kind of reveal and discovery late on, which drives on the action, and that's a really important part of Victorian literature, which is really interesting. And in that way, like, the unknown itself becomes a kind of theme in Victorian literature, which I think is really interesting. And then the other things that both of these books are love stories. They're quite different kinds of love stories, and I would say the love story element is possibly not necessarily more to the forefront. It's more featured in terms of the amount of scenes of Jane and Rochester talking in Jane Eyre, but it's very important in Great Expectations too, especially as what drives Pip in most of the novel, what drives him to want to be a gentleman, is his feelings towards Stella. I'll talk a bit later in the spoilery section of my video about the ways in which these two love stories and their closures compare, but I do think it's very important that love is very central to both of these books, as it is to so many Victorian novels. Like, so many Victorian novels are love stories, and most of them, even if that's not their main element, have some kind of love story in it. Another thing I think is really interesting is that the way that these two books explore and interact love is really interesting. Love for Jane Eyre is a journey of self-discovery, love for Pip is mostly a journey of self-destruction, and I think that's quite an interesting thing to look at when you read these books. And the fifth kind of novel, which is the most interesting to me perhaps in the Victorian period, is the novel of social commentary. These two are not as typical as social commentary novels than a lot of other things, but they do comment on quite a lot in society. The Victorian social commentary novel is a fascinating form and tends to be books that really look at what people within the Victorian society think is wrong with Victorian society and how it can be improved. I love these books. I find them fascinating because I'm really interested in the history of the time. I do think there is quite a lot in these. Great Expectations is one of Dickens's like less overtly social criticism novels, but there is a lot about perception, about snobbery, about class, about the damages that money can do, and about the way in which money can make people react, the way in which class and social mobility can affect people's relationships with people. And in Jane Eyre you kind of have the same thing. It's a social critique of class snobbery if you look at characters like Blanche Ingram and the way that she talks about governesses. There's also a lot of social criticism inherent in the character of Mrs. Reed, Jane's aunt, and her cruelty to Jane, about the way that people treat children. In fact, both of these books look very interestingly about the ways in which adults treat children, which leads me on quite nicely to talking about some of the themes that these books deal with. This is going to be a really, really long video anyway. So now I'm going to talk about a few themes that both of these books deal with that I feel like quite a lot of Victorian novels deal with as well. This is still all spoiler free. I'm going to talk about, I think, 5 or 6 themes that will be spoiler free, and then I will tell you when we're going into spoiler territory so that if you haven't read these books you can leave. These few themes I want to talk about, I can talk about in general without spoiling things. The first theme I want to talk about is childhood and the way that Victorian literature deals with childhood. It's been said many times that the Victorians invented childhood, that what we consider childhood today was kind of created during the Victorian period. It's not necessarily that, you know, children weren't children before, just that there's a kind of commercialisation of childhood in the 19th century, as there is a commercialisation and industrialisation of many things. I think it's really interesting that a lot of Victorian books do start with childhood and do deal with children growing up, and especially in these two books they start with quite similar childhoods in some ways. Both Jane and Pip are to an extent unwanted. They live with blood relatives, with family members who don't really want them. Pip's situation is quite different from Jane's in that Pip has Jo, and Jo very clearly wants and loves Pip very much, but both of them do experience this sense of being unwanted by a relative and also a sense of injustice. One thing I noticed in reading these two books recently, because I reread them for this video and I reread them within the space of a fortnight, and it's really interesting to see all the comparisons between them. And one thing I did notice is that in both of these books, very early on, both the child Jane and the child Pip experience important sensations of injustice. My head still ached and bled with the blow and the fall I had received. No one had reproved John for wantonly striking me, and because I had turned against him to avert further irrational violence, I was loaded with general operation. Unjust, unjust, said my reason. That is when Jane has been hit by her cousin and is shut up in the Red Room. Then Pip, similarly, after he's been kind of dismissed as a Stella as being coarse and common, he also feels this injustice. In the little world in which children have their existence, whosoever brings them up, there is nothing so finely perceived and so finely felt as injustice. Both these books begin with childhood and begin with this childhood sense of injustice, of being treated unfairly by the world. And that kind of unfair treatment of the world, both of the protagonist and of other people, the way in which society is unfair and which the way the world is organised is cruel and unfair, is really important in both of these books as a method of social criticism. I want to talk about the theme of growing up. I've already spoken about this, talking about how these books are billed as romance, but I do think it's interesting and worth stressing how important character development is to both of these books, and how the idea of individuality is very important in these books. There's a focus too on emotions. Both of these books are, yes, a kind of actual journey in that things happen to these characters and plot occurs, but they're also emotional journeys. Both of these characters change in their way across the books. Pip changes a lot across the course of the book, but so does Jane. If you look at the way she changes between her childhood and her adulthood, the way she not exactly mellows, but her temper changes and the way she behaves to other people changes as well. Both of these books do deal with emotional journeys on the characters, and a great emphasis is put on the kind of emotional and interior life as well as external life. To return to the theme of childhood, it's also really interesting to look at the fact that both of these characters are orphans, and that orphans feature in a lot of Victorian novels. Someone on the Goodreads group, the discussion board for these two books, I think it was Mike, he commented, "What is it with Victorian books and orphans?" which made me laugh, because yes, what is it with Victorian books and orphans? I mean, both Jane and Pip know who their parents are, they just happen to be dead. But the quest to find unknown parents is really common in Victorian literature, which is fascinating that it's such an important theme, but it is. I think it's partly because a lot of issues of respectability, which is so important in the Victorian period, is bound up with birth and who your parents are. So the idea of not knowing who your parents are calls into question your whole social status. I think that's why, one of the reasons why orphans are really interesting to the Victorians. And the other thing I think is to do with the Victorians exploring themes of otherness and outsiders. Both Pip and Jane are to an extent outsiders. Both outsiders in the sense that they are orphans and that they are lonely from their childhood and that they don't feel the proper family connection they want to, that they feel a little unwanted. Again, I think this is more the case with Jane than with Pip, because Pip does have this relationship with Jo, and then even Jane, once she goes away to school, she has the relationship she has with Helen Burns or with her teacher, Miss Temple, but they do experience the feeling of being unwanted and not belonging in the life they live. This is partly to do with them being orphans and not having that direct family contact, but it's also partly to do with their issues of class, which is another really important theme in Victorian literature. Just all of the themes just link together so perfectly. This is why I enjoy Victorian literature. To talk for a moment about class, both Great Expectations and Jane Eyre involve a surprising amount of social mobility for 19th century novels. Both Jane and Pip move about in class quite a lot, which is quite curious. In that way, this does make them sort of outsiders. For Pip, as a boy, because he has this experience with Miss Havisham and Estella, and because he wants to be a gentleman, and because he likes reading and learning a lot more than his sister and brother-in-law, neither of who can really read, he wants to be a gentleman, so he doesn't really feel part of the working class environment which he's in. He doesn't feel that he'll be a good blacksmith because he wants to be a gentleman. And then when he is a gentleman, he is also outside of that world because he spent years being apprenticed to a blacksmith. He is trained as a blacksmith, and to live in this new world that is so different and alien to him, that makes him an outsider as well. And the same is true of Jane Eyre. When Jane is a child, she is brought up by her aunt, who is very wealthy. She is brought up in this very, very wealthy household, but a bit like someone like Fanny in Mansfield Park, she's not really part of that household, and one of the servants says to her, "You are less than a servant, for you do nothing for your keep." Jane is at a very dubious social position within their house because she is educated with the young ladies and gentlemen of the house, but she is considered very, very far beneath them. And then when she goes on to be a governess, governesses always have a very mysterious social position within Victorian society, and it's the figure of the governess is something that the Victorians are very overly concerned with because they're really confused. They don't know how to deal with governesses because governesses have to instruct their children and therefore have to have some authority over their children, but also are paid employees and therefore have to have some subordination to their children, and it just confuses the Victorians no end. So in that way, Jane occupies a very odd social position. Both of these books do very interesting things with class and looking at characters who don't fit into a set class structure, and that's another really, really important theme within the Victorian period. And part of the reason for this is that class in the Victorian period suddenly becomes a lot more fluid than ever before because their industry brings new possibilities of changing your class, because industry brings new possibilities of working your way up. Suddenly in the Victorian period, people are moving class more than ever before, and this gives the Victorians a fascination with social mobility and also a deep distrust of it. And so characters with dubious social and class positions become a fascination for the Victorian period, which is why you see books like Jane Eyre and Great Expectations. And in Victorian literature, more than ever before, there's a lot of characters who change their class and social status a lot. If you look at something like David Copperfield or Oliver Twist, and so many Dickens novels, as well as Gaskell novels and Trollope novels, there's so many characters whose class position changes dramatically over the course of the book, which I think is fascinating. Anyway, but as I've been talking about how industrialisation changed what class meant in the Victorian period, I should also talk about industrialisation, a theme that is surprisingly absent from both of these books, considering they are Victorian novels and so many of the Victorian novels deal with industry, including North and South and Hard Times, which we'll be looking at in 2 months' time, specifically for how they deal with industry. These two books do not deal with industry at all, and this is quite interesting. And part of the reason why is because both of them are set before the Victorian period. In Great Expectations, Pip talks about this being in the time of Old London Bridge. The Old London Bridge was demolished in the early 1830s, so this book is set predominantly in the 1820s. Likewise, Jane Eyre is set in the reign of George III, it's set before the Victorian period. And this is another really interesting thing. A lot of Victorian novels actually are set before the Victorian period, something like Wuthering Heights, and also things like Little Dorrit by Charles Dickens. These books are set before the Victorian period. They're set in the kind of 40 years leading up to Queen Victoria's reign, which is a period that really interests people, and in many ways I think it's because of how dramatically changing the 19th century was, and therefore a lot of Victorian authors found it quite interesting to write about the time period slightly before the actual time period they were in, because society was changing so much, and this really interested them. I will talk a lot more about industrialisation over the course of this very long series, but I think it's worth noting that these two books don't really talk about industrialisation. So that brings to a close the non-spoilery part of my video. It's probably still been a fairly big chunk of time that I've been talking about these two books, but from now on I will be talking in spoiler territory. There will be a lot of spoilers, so if you haven't read both of these books, I would recommend stopping watching this video now, because both of these books have quite important grand reveals later on, and I would hate to spoil it for you if you haven't read them. So if you haven't read these books, please stop watching now. I've given you fair warning. Goodbye. But if you're still here and you have read both of these books, there are many more important and interesting things to say. Please be aware, if you're watching this part of the video, if you leave comments down below, just put spoiler warnings, especially just because there are such big reveals, like Bertha Mason and Magwitch. Just very important dramatic things in these books that I feel like you would get less out of the book if you knew in advance. First, I want to look at how these two books look at crime and taboo, because both of them talk about stuff that is not allowed. This kind of, as I spoke about, the kind of influence of the Gothic, the idea of talking about what you're not supposed to talk about in Victorian society, which is suddenly fascinating. In the Victorian period, people were fascinated with crime. You can see it in the books of Sherlock Holmes, you can see it in so many other novels. There are so many crimes in so many different Victorian novels. The figure of Magwitch is a very important figure in Great Expectations. On the one hand, he is this kind of imposing figure, he is an embodiment of crime, he is described as being frightening, and he terrifies Pip at the very beginning of the book. And when Pip finds out later on in the book that Magwitch, that this ex-convict is his benefactor, he is appalled and he is disgusted, because it offends all his senses of morality and respectability, because he's been trying to be a respectable gentleman and suddenly all respectability is broken because his fortune has been made by someone who has been in prison for most of his life. On that hand, there is that exploration of crime, but there's also something else really important here, is that Magwitch is actually a really nice person. You'll understand why he is as he is, and his affection for Pip and his love of Pip and what he wants to do for Pip makes him a really generous and kind and interesting person. He is not a character you dislike at all, and he's not a character by the end of it that you're at all afraid of. And that is very, very important, because Dickens is questioning a lot of Victorian views. It's a social critique in a way. Magwitch's portrayal, it's Dickens saying, well, just because someone's been in prison doesn't mean they're evil. And I also think it's worth looking at, I'm going to say taboo rather than crime in here, but obviously Rochester does try to marry Jane and he already has a wife, and bigamy is a crime. I know there are a lot of problematic things about Rochester, and once you read Why Does the Gas Go See, you see that, but I still think that Rochester is an appealing and interesting and sympathetic character. He is sympathetic, even if you've read Why Does the Gas Go See. Every time I read this, I still think he is a sympathetic character. He may be problematic, but he's still sympathetic. As I already mentioned, another taboo that I think both of these books do look at is sexuality. Not explicitly, obviously, but Pip's love for Estella, the very strong bond between them is one that is very emotional, and it's so much to do with so much, that Estella is bound up in Pip's childhood, that Estella is one of the first people that made Pip look at himself in a different way, that in many ways everything in his life has been influenced by the meeting with her, and he says this at various points of the book, but it's also a very strong attraction. She's very, very beautiful, and no matter how heartless she is, Pip can't believe that she is completely heartless because she's so beautiful. How could she possibly be heartless when she is that pretty? And it is a very strong emotional but also physical attraction that he feels towards her, and that's really important. Likewise in Jane Eyre, there is a very strong physical as well as emotional and intellectual connection between Jane and Rochester, and for a Victorian novel, and for quite an early Victorian novel, there's a lot of kissing in this book. Like in Hardy, there's just a lot of kissing, and that's later on in the Victorian period. If you compare books like Jane Eyre to Dickens' books from around the same time, Dickens' books in which no one ever kisses each other in a romantic way, like nearly ever. Lots of people kiss each other in a very non-romantic way, but there's very few like romantic kisses. In Jane Eyre, Charlotte Bronte goes to quite a lot of lengths to describe the physicality of the relationship between Jane and Rochester once they're engaged. Even the way they talk about their love for each other is very much about there being like a physical link between them. And there are so many like sexual taboos going on. Of course there is the issue of Rochester trying to marry someone when he's already married, but also the fact that Adele may very well be his illegitimate child, the fact that he's had many mistresses before, and the fact that after Jane discovers that he has a wife living, he basically wants to make Jane his mistress. He kind of says he doesn't, but we all know he basically does. And the way that sexuality is not separate from love in these two books, and in a lot of Victorian novels, is really important. It's not something that is spoken about that much in the Victorian period, but it is in a lot of their novels. The other thing I want to talk about, it's only second on my list of spoilery themes, goodness. The other thing I want to talk about is mad women in attics. Obviously that term applies to Jane Eyre, in which there is literally a mad woman in the attic. It's important, of course, in Jane Eyre that for Charlotte Bronte, or at least for Mr. Rochester and to an extent for Jane, Bertha's madness is bound up with her immorality. I made a video a little while ago called The Drunk Man in the Metaphorical Attic, in which I compared Jane Eyre with The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, which in many ways deal with similar plots but with the gender swapped. I think when you read The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, if you look at it in comparison to Jane Eyre, it gives you a slightly different view of the way Bertha is presented. But madness is an important theme in Victorian literature, both in terms of being something that cannot be spoken of, but also something that cannot be understood, something that is so other and dangerous and also often feminine. Not always, but actually always. Can I think of any books that explore male madness? No, I'm sure there are some. If you've read a Victorian novel that looks at male insanity, I would like to know. I really would. Madness is, in general, in Victorian literature, it's female, it's bound up with hysteria and overly emotionalness. Oh, the Victorians. But it's really interesting to look at in terms of gender and in the way that Bertha is presented as being too passionate and too violent, and all of her emotions being like over the top, like her anger and her jealousy. But Rochester talks about her being like unchaste when she was younger, like all of her passions, all of her emotions are pushed to the extreme, which is what to an extent makes her mad. But then another mad woman in the attic sort of to look at is Miss Havisham. Now Miss Havisham is not mad. I don't think it's ever implied that Miss Havisham is mad in the way that it's implied that Bertha is mad. But she is a kind of figure of a mad woman in some ways. Bertha is locked in the attic in Thornfield Hall. Miss Havisham is shut up in her own house. Of course, Bertha is kept there by force, and Miss Havisham keeps herself there by choice because she doesn't want to leave. But she is presented in many ways as mad, you know, walking around in a very, very, very old wedding dress with one shoe off, one shoe on, forever, having stopped all the clocks, not wanting to know what day of the week it is. Interestingly, she is also presented, a bit like Bertha, as a vision of femininity gone wrong. Bertha is a woman who is not chaste and tempered enough. She is a woman who has too many emotions. All of her emotions are pushed to the extent that she is no longer even presented as quite human. She's presented almost as a beast. And then in Miss Havisham, you have a character who has no emotion, who has forced herself not to love because her heart was broken. She has decided that emotion is wrong, therefore she is cruel to everyone. And she brings up her adoptive daughter to be completely heartless. She brings up Stella to find it impossible to love because Miss Havisham is the other end of the spectrum. She's a woman with not enough emotion that is right for a woman within Victorian society, etc, etc. Like, that's just absolutely fascinating, and to compare her to Bertha, I think, is very interesting because they make for interesting figures. So many things I have to talk about, just running out of all the time in the world. I also wanted to talk about character arcs. Pip's journey over the novel is to become a better person. He's kind of fine as a child. Then, after he decides he wants to be a gentleman, and after he decides that he has been common and coarse all his life, he then goes on to be very, very cruel to Jo. How horrible he is to Jo, and how selfish and self-absorbed and snobbish Pip becomes in the novel is hard. And the book is basically about Pip realising what a jerk he's been. It's very effective, and the book is about him realising that all his judgments have been wrong. The way he judged Magwitch when he found out he was his benefactor, the way he has judged Jo and Biddy. he's got everything wrong. And the other thing I do like about Great Expectations is he's not rewarded for the life he's led. Biddy, who actually would have been a much better match for Pip than anyone, marries Joe, not Pip. And when Pip meets Estella at the end, they meet in kind of sadness and they part. I know you can read the ending very different ways, but to me, my interpretation of the book, they part forever. The shadow Pip sees at the end of the book, when he says, "I saw no shadow of another parting from her," it's because they will never part again, because they will never see each other again. It's not that they will be together forever, it's that they will part. It's open to interpretation, it's purposefully ambiguous, but if you consider the alternative ending we know Dickens wrote, where they meet and Estella's married to someone else, and if you look at the lines before that where Pip says, "We are friends," and Estella says, "And we'll continue friends apart," the idea is that they part forever. Pip is not rewarded. He learns that he should have been a better person and he becomes a better person, but he doesn't get the life he wanted. That's his journey, is discovering that he wasn't a very nice person. Whereas Jane Eyre, I think, is more about Jane being true to herself. She does change, she becomes, I think, a more tolerant person between her childhood and her adulthood, but for a lot of the time it's about her being true to herself, about her realising her own worth, which partly comes through her love of Rochester and his love of her, but also then realising that she has a worth outside of that. Like when she leaves, when she discovers he has a wife living, and when she runs because that is what fits with her moral code. She is true to her moral code. She doesn't give in to what he wants to do because she loves him and she wants to make him happy. She does what she wants to do because that's what her morality and that's what herself tells her to do. That is being true to her personality, and she is rewarded for that by the author with money and Bertha's death, and therefore with Mr. Rochester, which is very convenient. Obviously her personality does change over the book, but it's also a lot about her personality being proved right, about her coming into her own and realising how much worth she has, because she's had this childhood in which she was treated as worthless by everybody, in which her aunt and her cousins dismissed her, and then if you look at what happens to her cousins, like, they just have horrible lives, whereas Jane is kind of rewarded with happiness because she has been right. And I think that's really interesting to look at in terms of these two books. Someone pointed out on the not-so-hypothetical Victorian literature course Goodreads group, I think her name's Carolina, and she pointed out that it's really interesting how in Great Expectations, for Pip to become a better person, for Pip to achieve his final ending, Pip has to lose all his money and start working, whereas Jane Eyre has to stop working and get lots of money. Isn't that quite interesting? One, in terms of gender roles, in possibly a slightly depressing way, that Jane has to stop work to be happy and Pip has to work to be happy in a kind of male-female way. But also, aside from that, because I don't think it's so simple, I think the reason why Jane Eyre has to have that money and stop working is so she can be equal to Rochester, who has lots of money and doesn't work. She has been his dependent in a literal way in that he paid her salary, and now he is her dependent in that he relies on her because he is blind. Whereas the reason why Pip has to start working at the end of the book is because he has to go back to a life of work in order to realise that he can have a life with meaning outside of having lots of money and being a gentleman and being married to Estella. So the different endings serve quite different purposes, but I do think it's an interesting comparison between them. A lot of Victorian novels, as I mentioned earlier, deal with social mobility, and a lot of them deal with kind of like rags to riches stories, and Jane Eyre is basically a rags to riches stories in a way, but Pip in Great Expectations is more of like a rags to riches to rags again story, and then maybe to riches because he kind of works hard and does well at the end and kind of gets some money from that. But it's a very kind of different story, because actually what Dickens does in Great Expectations really interestingly is that he has a rags to riches story in which riches are really proved not to be nearly so good as rags. And I do think to look at the endings of both of these books is also quite interesting in terms of the grander context of endings within Victorian literature. I think there's a critic who said that in Victorian literature all of the books either end with wedding bells or with death. And it's kind of true. I was having a think, and the only books I can think of that end neither with weddings or with death are some of the Sherlock Holmes books. I can't think of any other Victorian novels that end neither with weddings or with death. Not like always the main character getting married, but there's always a wedding or a death. So Jane Eyre, wedding, obviously, and death because Bertha dies, and I think also St. John dies in the very last sentence. It's a weird way to end Jane Eyre, but there we go. Obviously Jane Eyre ends with "Reader, I married him," but there's also the weddings of Jane's cousins, and there's also the death of Bertha and the death of St. John, which are important in the end of the book. Then Great Expectations ends with a death in that it sort of ends with the death of Magwitch. I know that's not like exactly the end, but it is in the kind of closing section of the book. It also ends with the death of Miss Havisham, and it also ends with the marriage of Joe and Biddy, and in a way the marriage of Clara and Herbert as well. And the final ending of Great Expectations, I know I've already touched on this, but I feel like the ending of Great Expectations is a wonderful ending because I love the ambiguity of it, and whatever you may think about the ending, even if you do think that the shadow of no other parting from her is because they are together, like most of the film and TV adaptations suggest and show. It's still no, Rita, I married him. It's not that obvious, it's not that clear, and that I think is really, really interesting in terms of comparing these two books. That is all I wanted to say. I say all. I've been filming for a really long time. I've been filming for about 2 hours. I'm a bit worried about how long this video will be, but I hope you have found some of my rambling thoughts, my rambling Victorian thoughts interesting. I'm very excited and hyper now, so I hope I haven't been talking too quickly. But it has been great fun to ramble on in this very long lecture about Great Expectations and Jane Eyre as an introduction to the Victorian novel. I hope that you will enjoy reading the next two if you're going to do so. So in 2 months' time in May, I'll be talking about North and South by Elizabeth Gaskell and Hard Times by Charles Dickens, and more specifically be talking about the way that industry operates within them and is explored. Not just industrialisation in terms of economy, but also the effect that industrialisation has on the way people think. Definitely look out for that as well, because it's really interesting to look at a kind of industrial mindset, which is fascinating to the Victorians and explored a lot in them. But more on that in 2 months' time. I'm now gonna go because I have been talking for a very long time and my throat hurts. But anyway, I hope you have enjoyed this video. So long, hypothetical students. Class dismissed. I didn't even read any of my quotes. I have so many quotes. I read like 2.